There's a story buried inside Microsoft's history that almost nobody knows, and the terrifying part is it did not happen once. It happened 3 times. The same company, the same strategy, the same outcome, different victims every single time. And the reason almost nobody knows this story is because it did not happen in the dark. It happened in open court. It happened in front of federal judges. It happened with documented evidence and sworn testimony. And still, the world moved on and forgot. The first victim was Netscape. They held 90% of the web browser market. They were the company that put the internet on your screen for the very first time in human history. They introduced ordinary people to the World Wide Web and made it something anyone could use. They were powerful, they were dominant, they were essential, and they were gone inside 4 years. The second victim was Novell. They owned one of the most powerful word processors ever built called WordPerfect, and a network operating system that corporations around the entire world depended on every single day to run their businesses. Their company lost $1.2 billion in value. They were forced to sell everything they had built. They eventually had to sue Microsoft just to find out exactly why it happened to them and what had been done behind closed doors. The third target is not history. The third target is happening right now, today, while you're reading this. And this time the target is Linux, the free open source operating system that millions of people around the world use every single day to escape Microsoft Windows. The operating system that runs more than half of the world's web servers. The one that powers the internet. Infrastructure that every person on Earth depends on whether they know it or not. The one you may be thinking about switching to yourself right now because you are fed up with what Microsoft has done to your computer, your data, your privacy, and your choices. Here's the question that matters more than anything else you will read today. Is Microsoft doing to Linux exactly what it did to Netscape and Novell? And if so, how far along is that plan right now in this moment? Everything you are about to read is documented. It happened in open court. It was confirmed by federal judges and sworn testimony. There is one specific moment from the Novell case, a moment that took place inside a federal courtroom in Salt Lake City that tells you everything you need to know about how Microsoft actually operates when it believes nobody important is watching. That moment will permanently change how you see every single thing Microsoft is doing today. In 1995, Netscape Navigator had 90% of the browser market. Read that number one more time and let it sit with you. 90%. This was not just the most popular browser on the planet. It was essentially the only browser that most ordinary human beings had ever used in their entire lives. The internet, as the world experienced it for the very first time, ran through Netscape. If you wanted to see a website, if you wanted to read news online, if you wanted to send an email through a web interface, you opened Netscape Navigator. That was the complete story of internet access for hundreds of millions of people. Netscape was not just a product. It was the gateway to an entirely new world, and it held that position with 90% dominance. By the year 2002, just 7 years later, Internet Explorer held 96% of the browser market. Netscape's share had not just declined, it had collapsed completely to almost nothing. A company that once owned the gateway to the entire World Wide Web, that once held the most dominant market position in the history of the browser industry, had been effectively destroyed in less than 7 years. And here's the part that the simplified version of history always gets wrong. That did not happen because Internet Explorer was a better product. That is not why Netscape died. It happened because Microsoft bundled Internet Explorer with every single copy of Windows. And Windows ran on more than 90% of the personal computers on planet Earth at that time. You did not choose Internet Explorer. You did not download it. Because you read a review and decided it was superior. You did not select it from a list of options and make an informed decision. It was simply there the moment you turned on your computer. It was pre-installed, preloaded, and presented as the default before you ever had the chance to consider an alternative. Netscape had to ask you to go and download it separately. Microsoft had already preloaded the competition directly into the operating system before you touched the keyboard for about the first time. A senior Intel executive testified under oath during the federal antitrust trial that a Microsoft executive had described the strategy in plain and chilling terms. Give away the browser completely for free. Integrate it directly into Windows so deeply that removing it becomes nearly impossible. And in the exact words that were used at the time, cut off Netscape's air supply. Microsoft disputed the specific phrasing of that quote afterward, but the strategy itself was never disputed by anyone in that courtroom. It was documented in writing. Microsoft spent more than $100 million every single year developing Internet Explorer, a product it gave away to every customer completely for free, because losing money on the browser meant protecting billions of dollars in Windows revenue. This was not competition in any normal sense of that word. This was not a company building a better product and winning customers through superior quality. This was calculated, strategic, financially deliberate elimination of a competitor using the power of a monopoly operating system as the weapon. Novell's story is different in its specific details, but it is completely identical in its underlying structure and its final outcome. WordPerfect was the dominant word processor in the world long before Microsoft Word even existed as a product. This is something that younger people often do not realize because they grew up in a world where Microsoft Office was simply the standard. But before that world existed, WordPerfect owned the professional document creation market. Lawyers used it, doctors used it, government agencies across multiple countries used it, universities used it for academic work. It was the professional standard across the entire English-speaking world and beyond. Nobody questioned whether WordPerfect would survive because it seemed too big, too embedded in professional workflows, and too important to daily business operations to ever simply disappear. Novell alleged in federal court that Microsoft deliberately removed key technical interfaces from Windows 95 at the very last minute before the operating system launched. These were not minor technical details. These were interfaces that WordPerfect fundamentally depended on to function properly within the new Windows 95 environment. And the critical detail that makes this allegation so serious is this. Microsoft allegedly removed those interfaces without telling Novell that it was going to do so. Novell's engineers had been spending enormous amounts of time, money, and professional effort building a Windows 95 version of WordPerfect based on promises Microsoft had made and technical access Microsoft had provided. They were building G toward a specific destination that Microsoft had shown them. Then quietly, without warning, without notification, without any communication at all, the door was closed. The technical foundation they had been building on was removed. And Novell's engineers only discovered this when it was already too late to do anything meaningful about it. Novell said it was later forced to sell WordPerfect at a loss of $1.2 billion. The company that had purchased WordPerfect for nearly $1.5 billion watched that entire investment evaporate because the operating system it needed to run on had quietly pulled the technical foundation from underneath it. Microsoft eventually paid Novell $536 million to settle earlier antitrust claims. Then Novell turned around and filed suit again, specifically over what had happened to WordPerfect, seeking $1 billion in damages. In the autumn of 2011, a federal courthouse in Salt Lake City became the stage for one of the most remarkable and unusual legal dramas in the entire history of the technology industry. Novell was suing Microsoft for $1 billion, and the case required Microsoft to put its most important historical figure on the stand. Bill Gates, the co-founder of Microsoft and the architect of its entire business empire, sat in that federal courtroom for 2 full days and testified under oath about decisions he had personally made in the mid-1990s. Gates told the court he had no idea that his decision to remove the technical interface in question would affect Novell in any meaningful way. He said he had made the change to protect Windows 95 from outside code that could potentially cause the operating system to crash. He described WordPerfect in sworn testimony as a bulky, slow, and buggy product that did not integrate properly with Windows. Novell's attorneys stood in that same courtroom and told a completely different story, supported by documents and testimony of their own. They described Microsoft as having purposefully misled a Utah company, a company with more than 1,000 employees, a company that had invested nearly $1.5 billion in acquiring WordPerfect and then invested enormous additional resources in making that software work with Microsoft's new operating system into a complete dead end. They called it, in their closing arguments, a purely predatory action with no legitimate technical justification. The jury deadlocked and could not reach a unanimous verdict. The judge dismissed the remaining claims after the jury failed. Novell appealed the dismissal. The appeals court sided with Microsoft. The legal system produced no remedy, no compensation, and no accountability. But the human reality on the ground was not abstract, and it was not limited to corporate balance sheets. WordPerfect had been the word processor of choice for lawyers, doctors, government agencies, and universities across the English-speaking world for an entire decade. The program that had dominated word processing throughout the 1980s simply vanished from relevance within just a few years. The people who had built entire careers at WordPerfect Corporation, who had spent years working inside Novell's software division, who had invested their professional lives in those companies, experienced an outcome that the courts declined to call illegal, but that a jury of ordinary American citizens could not unanimously agree was innocent. That distinction is not a small thing. A jury of 12 regular people, having heard all the evidence and all the testimony, including 2 days of Bill Gates on the stand, could not unanimously agree that what Microsoft did was acceptable. Remember that. By the time Microsoft's antitrust consent decree expired in 2011, Microsoft's most dangerous enemy was no longer Netscape, which had already been eliminated. It was no longer Novell, which had already been broken and sold off. It was an operating system that no single company owned, that could not be acquired through a corporate acquisition, that could not be bought out or merged away, and that was spreading across the world's server infrastructure faster than anything Microsoft could build to compete with it. That operating system was Linux, and Microsoft's CEO at the time had already told the entire world exactly what he thought about it more than a decade earlier. In 2001, Steve Ballmer sat down with the Chicago Sun-Times and said this directly. Linux is a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. He was not speaking carelessly or emotionally in that moment. He was speaking strategy. For the decade that followed that cancer remark, Microsoft fought Linux the way it had fought Netscape and Novell, through sustained pressure, patent threats, legal attacks, and financial leverage over companies that depended on Linux-based products. Microsoft supported SEO Group's copyright attack on Linux in the early 2000s, a legal campaign specifically designed to threaten the legal standing of the entire open source ecosystem and make corporations afraid to build on Linux. Microsoft made repeated public claims that Linux violated unnamed and unspecified Microsoft patents, and used those claims strategically to pressure Android device manufacturers, companies that built their entire product lines on the Linux kernel, into signing patent licensing agreements. Reports from that period indicated Microsoft was collecting more revenue per Android device from those patent licensing deals than it made from selling some of its own software products. The strategy was completely recognizable to anyone who had watched what happened to Netscape and Novell: attack the legal standing of Linux, create fear and uncertainty around its use, make enterprise customers afraid to commit to it, keep corporations loyal to Windows by making the alternative feel legally dangerous. Then something changed everything. The cloud happened. When Satya Nadella became CEO of Microsoft in February 2014, he understood something fundamental that his predecessors had not fully accepted or acted on. The future of computing was not going to be decided on the desktop, where Windows still dominated. It was going to be decided in massive data centers around the world, and those data centers already ran Linux overwhelmingly. Microsoft's Azure cloud computing platform was actively competing for enterprise customers who needed serious Linux support, and Microsoft could not build a credible competitive cloud business while simultaneously treating Linux as an existential enemy to be legally attacked and commercially undermined. So Nadella stood up in front of the technology world and said 3 words that sent genuine shockwaves through every corner of the industry. Microsoft loves Linux. Microsoft joined the Linux Foundation as a paying member. It began contributing actual code to the Linux kernel itself. It built the Windows subsystem for Linux, a tool that allows developers to run Linux software directly inside Windows without ever leaving the Microsoft ecosystem. And in 2018, Microsoft acquired GitHub for $7.5 billion in cash. GitHub is the largest platform on earth for storing, sharing, discovering, and collaborating on open source software code. It is where the Linux kernel itself lives. An acquisition, Microsoft became the landlord of the entire open source world. And here's the point where the pattern becomes not just visible, but impossible to honestly ignore. Because every single move Microsoft made toward Linux followed the exact same documented 3-phase strategy that federal antitrust investigators had identified and confirmed from the Netscape era. Phase 1 is embrace. Phase 2 is extend. Phase 3 is extinguish. The phrase embrace, extend, extinguish was not invented by critics of Microsoft trying to be dramatic. It was documented by the United States Department of Justice. Internal Microsoft communications from the 1990s described in writing a deliberate strategy of engaging with open internet standards, extending those standards with Microsoft-specific additions, and features that competitors could not easily replicate, and then using those proprietary differences to make the original open versions feel incomplete, inferior, and eventually obsolete. Watch what Microsoft has done with Linux through that exact documented lens. Embrace. Microsoft began contributing to the Linux kernel in 2009, initially focused specifically on making Linux run better and more efficiently inside Azure's cloud infrastructure. Those contributions were real, they were technically substantive, and they were welcomed by the Linux community. Microsoft also began shipping Linux distributions through the Windows Store and made Linux command line tools a standard part of the Windows developer experience. Extend. The Windows subsystem for Linux now ships with a complete Linux kernel running inside Windows. Millions of developers who might have switched entirely and permanently to Linux as their primary operating system can now access much of the Linux experience without ever leaving the Windows environment. The compelling reason to make the full and complete switch becomes less obvious. The motivation to abandon Windows entirely and commit fully to Linux quietly and gradually weakens. In 2025, Microsoft went further still, open sourcing the Windows subsystem for Linux itself and releasing GitHub Copilot's client-side code under the MIT license. On the surface, to someone not paying close attention, these actions look like genuine gifts freely given to the open source community. Underneath that surface, they deepen developer dependence on Microsoft's infrastructure, Microsoft's servers, and Microsoft's continued goodwill in ways that are nearly invisible until someone actually tries to leave. GitHub now hosts over 150 million developers from every country on Earth. Every open source project that lives on GitHub, including the Linux kernel itself, depends on Microsoft servers to store its code, Microsoft tools to manage its development workflow, and Microsoft's continued goodwill to remain accessible. When the Zig programming language project made the decision to migrate away from GitHub in late 2025, that decision cost them access to more than $170,000 per year in GitHub sponsors' donation revenue that their project had been receiving through Microsoft's platform. They made the decision to leave anyway because they believed their independence was worth more than the money. But that $170,000 number tells you with complete clarity exactly how much financial leverage GitHub now holds over open source projects that have built their funding infrastructure on top of it. GitHub Copilot, the artificial intelligence coding assistant that was trained on billions of lines of publicly available code, much of it open source code released by developers who never consented to its use in Commercia LAI training, is now the most widely used AI tool among professional software developers anywhere in the world. A lawsuit filed in 2022 alleged that Copilot was trained on open source code in ways that violated the specific licenses under which that code had been freely shared with the world. That case is still working its way through the courts, and no final answer has been reached. The Windows subsystem for Linux may be exactly what it presents itself as, a genuinely useful technical bridge for developers who legitimately need to work in both ecosystems. Or it may be doing quietly and gradually what Internet Explorer did loudly and aggressively, making it progressively less necessary for any developer to ever choose a non-Microsoft platform by absorbing the best features of Linux directly into Windows until the original feels redundant and the switch no longer feels worth making. Here is what the actual historical record tells us with certainty. Microsoft has never once been punished in a way that structurally and permanently changed its fundamental behavior. The 202 antitrust settlement produced a consent decree with behavioral limits. That consent decree expired completely in 2011. The behavior that federal courts formally found to be illegal in the year 2000 produced no corporate breakup, no individual executive accountability, and no permanent structural remedy of any kind. Novell's billion-dollar case ended without a verdict after the jury deadlocked. The pattern that repeated itself from Netscape to Novell was never genuinely interrupted or corrected by any legal or regulatory system. It only concluded each time once the targeted competitor had already been eliminated from the market. Dominance is not protection. The most powerful market position imaginable can disappear inside a decade when the company that controls the underlying operating system decides it wants what you have built. The open source community is now sitting with Linux running more than half of the world's server infrastructure. Watching a company that once publicly called their operating system a cancer now claim unconditionally and enthusiastically that it loves them. The question is not whether Microsoft is evil or whether Satya Nadella has genuinely good intentions. Leadership changes. Cultures shift over time. Financial incentives evolve as markets change. The real question is whether the structure of the modern technology industry allows any single company, no matter how well-intentioned its current leadership genuinely happens to be, to control the platform, the code repositor, the developer tools, and the AI assistant that the entire global software world depends on, without that extraordinary concentration of power eventually being used in the way that power has always historically been used. History does not say maybe. History says no. The story that started with Netscape in 1995 is not finished. The next chapter is being written right now. And unlike Netscape and unlike Novell, the people who could change the outcome of this chapter are still here, still building, still watching, and still have time to recognize the playbook before the final move is made.